Hi, in this video, we'll take a look at Incoterms 2020, what they mean, their application, and the benefits of using them. So, make sure to watch the full video if you're new exporters. We've got a lot to cover in today's video, so let's get started. So, what are Incoterms and who made them? Incoterms are referred to as international commercial terms. Incoterms defines the risk and responsibility of a shipment between the buyer and the seller. Incoterms were developed by the International Chambers of Commerce. So why do we use Incoterms? Incoterms holds a universal meaning around the world. People use Incoterms to avoid misunderstandings in foreign trade contracts by clarifying the tasks, costs, and risks. How to use Incoterms? If parties want Incoterm 2020 rules to apply to their contract, the safest way is to clearly mention it in the contract. For example, CIF Hong Kong Incoterms 2020. ICC grouped the Incoterms 2020 into two categories. Number 1, rules for any modes of transport, and number 2, rules for sea and inland waterways transport. In the first group, we have 7 Incoterms. We have created an easy-to-understand chart that displays Incoterms 2020. The left side of the chart displays the different types of Incoterms beginning from top to bottom. The top side of the chart displays the different obligations and charges and displays which are covered by the seller and which are covered by the buyer. The blue points to the sellers and the yellow points to the buyer. So, let's start at the first Incoterm, EXW, which means X Works or X Warehouse. In X Works, the seller is only responsible for ensuring that the cargo is packaged so it is ready for export and the goods can be collected from their location. The risk or liability for the goods transfers to the buyer when the goods are made available at the agreed-upon place. The buyer bears all risks and costs once they collect the goods from the seller's location. By applying this rule, the buyer and the seller do not have to make an insurance contract. Now it's time for Incoterm number 2, FCA, which means Free Carrier. In FCA, the seller is responsible for the export clearance and the delivery of goods to the carrier at the named place of delivery. The Incoterms 2020 FCA has 2 possible delivery locations. Number 1, if the place of delivery is at the seller's premises, the seller must load the goods. Number 2, if the delivery takes place in a different location, the seller is not responsible for unloading. When the goods have been delivered by the seller to the selected location, the risk transfers to the buyer. The buyer is responsible for paying the price of goods and all that transportation fees from the seller's place to the buyer's selected place. In FCA, it becomes the buyer's responsibility to determine if they would like to obtain an insurance policy. Moving right along to Incoterm number 3, CPT. CPT, also known as Carriage Paid To. In a CPT Incoterm, the seller is responsible for clearing the goods for export and delivering the goods to the named place of destination with the transportation fees. The risk is transferred from the seller to the buyer as soon as the goods are delivered to the first carrier, even if there are multiple transportations. The buyer is only responsible for import requirements and local delivery and unloading charges. The seller is not responsible for any damages if the buyer has not insured the products because the goods have already been transferred to the first carrier. Without further ado, let's start things off with Incoterm number 4, CIP. The CIP stands for Carriage and Insurance Paid To. In CIP, the seller is responsible for delivering the goods to the destination, the cost of international freight, as well as insurance fees and charges. CIP is also very similar to CPT, except that with CIP, the seller is also responsible for arranging main carriage insurance. And let's dive right into Incoterm number 5, DAP. The DAP means delivered at place. Under the DAP, the seller is responsible for all costs and risks associated with the delivery of the goods to the final destination, usually the buyer's premises. The risk transfers from seller to buyer when the goods are available for unloading. The buyer is then responsible for unloading the goods at the end destination. In DAP, both parties are not obligated to make a contract of insurance, but it is recommended. With that, it's time for our sixth Incoterm, DPU. DPU stands for Delivered at Place Unloaded. In DPU, the seller is responsible for all costs and risks until the goods are delivered to named destination place, which is usually close to the buyer. DPU is the only Incoterms rule that requires the seller to unload goods at the place of destination. The risk transfers from seller to buyer at the place of unloading. The buyer is responsible for import clearance procedures, and both parties are not obligated to obtain an insurance policy, but it is recommended. Moving right along to Incoterm number 7, DDP, which means Delivery Duty Paid. As per the shipping terms under DDP, the seller bears all costs and risks involved in delivering the goods to the selected place. It is also the only term where the seller is liable for import custom fees. The risk transfers from the seller to buyer at the place of unloading. The buyer is then responsible for unloading the goods at the end destination. There is no obligation to insure the goods. The seller is not obligated to insure the goods for pre-carriage or main carriage. With that, we have completed our first category of Incoterms, and now it's time for Category 2, Rules for Sea and Inland Waterways Transport. Our first Incoterm is FAS. FAS stands for Free Alongside Ship. In FAS, the seller is liable and responsible for all the procedures in their country up until the goods are alongside the ship or the terminal warehouse. FAS indicates that the risk transfers to the buyer when the goods are placed alongside the ship. The buyer is responsible for loading the freight onto the vessel as well as handling local carriage, discharge, import formalities and duties, and onward carriage to the final destination. Insurance is not a stipulated requirement under FAS, however, it is a common practice for both buyer and seller to get insurance coverage of the cargo's journey they are each responsible for. Now it's time for Incoterm number 2, FOB. FOB is also known as Free On Board. In FOB, the seller clears the goods for export and ensures that they are delivered to and loaded onto the vessel for transport at the named port of departure. The risk transfers from the seller to the buyer when the goods are on board the vessel and the buyer bears costs from that point forward. The buyer arranges all the other stages to the cargo's ultimate destination. Insurance coverage isn't mandatory under the FOB Incoterm. However, it is common practice to obtain insurance. This may be done by the buyer, seller, or both to cover the entire ocean freight journey or their respective responsibilities. With that, it's time for our third Incoterm, CFR. CFR stands for Cost and Freight. The CFR Incoterm is an Incoterm that is exclusive to ocean freight shipping. In CFR, the seller is not only responsible for delivering the goods to the port specified by the buyer, but also bears the transportation costs of the goods to the destination port. The risk passes from seller to buyer when the seller delivers the goods on board the ship. The buyer is responsible for paying all the additional transport fees from the port of destination, including import clearance and duties. The seller is not responsible for procuring marine insurance against the risk of loss or damage to the cargo during transit. And now it's time for our last Incoterm, CIF. That stands for Cost, Insurance, and Freight Agreement, with the seller holding responsible for all three. In CIF terms, the seller clears the goods at origin, places the cargo on board, and pays for insurance until the port of discharge at the minimum coverage. The risk is transferred to the buyer at the time the goods are on board. The buyer assumes all risks once the goods are on board the vessel for the main carriage. However, they don't take on any costs until the freight arrives at the named port of destination. In CIF, the seller is obligated to take out the minimum level of insurance coverage for the buyer's risk. We have completed all Incoterms. Now you can decide which one is the best for you. I get a lot of questions from the new exporters. Like, for example, which Incoterm is the best for new exporters? Well, there is no best Incoterm. It all depends on the requirements of the buyer and the seller. In my opinion, these are some of the best Incoterms for new exporters: FOB, CFR, and FCA. If you learned something new from today's video, make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel right now. Just click on the button below this video. And if you want exclusive import-export training that I only share with subscribers, head over to usaeximclub.com. That is usaeximclub.com, and sign up for our newsletter. It's free. Now, I want to turn it over to you. Which Incoterm from this video are you going to use? Let me know by leaving a comment below right now. Thanks and good day.